I would like to welcome you to the 5,595th meeting of the Rotary Club of Chicago. And by ringing the bell, I open the meeting. And it is, with sadness and tenderness that I would like to share with you that a legend in the Rotary world, a past Rotary president called Cliff Dockman, left us on Thanksgiving Day. Cliff was 95 years old and probably the most amazing speaker I have ever heard in my life, not only for his ability to convey the truth, what Rotary is about, but the values and the quality of the work that we can do as Rotarians, but his sense of humor has been and is unmatched. So in the gyrator, you are going to see a speech that he gave a few years ago at the International Assembly. As some of you may know, that is the assembly where the district governors-elect receive training. And watch it, because it is really, really a good laugh that you're going to get. So with this, I would like to honor him by ringing the bell 3 times as we usually do. Well, before we go on with the meeting, I also would like to make a special mention of one guest, a very special guest that I found that we have today, and who is Alejandra Canseco from Mexico. Her grandpa was a president of Rotary International, and Cliff Dockman supported him enormously with the launching of the Polio Plus program. So these 2 gentlemen were leaders of our organization at a time when nobody in the development world or in the health world here in the United States could believe that an NGO would come with this extraordinary and insane goal of eliminating polio from the face of the earth. You need to keep in mind that at that time, we had 350,000 cases of polio per year in the world. And thanks to the leadership of these 2 gentlemen and the team that supported them, we are where we are today. So, these are really awesome role models that we have in our organization. So now, I would like to introduce my fellow president nominee. Well, she's going to be president, Alita Williams, who is going to make some announcements. So, Alita, here you are.
Thank you, Marga. Well, as we know, today is Giving Tuesday. So with that being said, please consider donating to the Rotary One Foundation. And we have a video. So you can give on our website, or for our members, we did email you all a wonderful pledge form that we would love for you all to fill out. And please be a part of helping us to continue to do the great work that we do. So the format of questions today, I'm sorry. And that's our annual goal campaign, the $75,000. I'm getting ready to have to run this next year, so I'm practicing for Timo. So let's please make sure that we meet and exceed our $75,000 goal this year. The formats for our questions, we will take questions at the end of the remarks. For those that are here in person at the ULC, please hold your questions to the end. And for those on Zoom, please type your questions in the chat box. Please honor our speaker's time by keeping your questions succinct, one question per person. Thank you. And today, excuse me, our speaker is Antonio Romanucci. Antonio Romanucci is a founding partner in the Chicago-based law firm Romanucci Blandin, LLC, a national trial practice committed to fighting for victims of negligence, abuse, and wrongful death arising from corporate negligence, civil rights actions, medical malpractice, mass torts, and class actions, as well as police misconduct. Most recently, he had the honor of representing the family of George Floyd in the civil lawsuit against the city of Minneapolis and 4 of its police officers alongside lead counsel Ben Crump. Romanucci has a steadfast commitment to fighting for those seeking justice across the country in complex, high-profile mass tort cases, such as the fight against e-cigarette manufacturer Juul, Boeing for its faulty 737 MAX aircraft, the carcinogenic environmental pollution caused by Sterigenics International in Willowbrook, Illinois, and the MGM Las Vegas shooting. He is a founding chairman of the Midwest Brain Injury Clubhouse, which is devoted to optimizing the lives and recovery of people affected by brain injuries or strokes. Romanucci is also the founder of the Justiana Society of Lawyers Charitable Endowment Fund, where thousands of dollars annually are awarded to needy organizations. Often called upon as an expert, Mr. Romanucci appears regularly on local and national television to comment on his own cases, as well as other high-profile legal matters and trends throughout the country. And then today he has a moderator with him, Jennifer McGuffin, Chief Communications Officer for Romanucci Blandin, who is responsible for the firm's media strategy and takes a lead role on legislative reform. She is a former journalist for nearly 20 years and was named Women of the Year in Advertising, Marketing, and Public Relations last year by the Stevie Awards for Women in Business. And now we have another video.
Oh, actually, Alita, I think the video is part of their slides.
Oh, sorry.
That I'll show. Yep.
Yeah, so we invite our speakers up to the front. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate being here. I want to also thank, I know he's not here, but David Hirsch. You know, David and I go back a long, long way. We lived in the same town for many years, and I'm sorry that he can't be here, but I wish him well. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself and why this discussion is taking place. And understand, this is a discussion, it's a conversation that, as I was talking to some folks here before, this is a conversation that hasn't gone away, it won't go away, and it'll be here for a very long time in our country. And my background, although, you know, that nice introduction you heard, I represent a whole different array of types of plaintiffs and different kinds of litigation. But my background truly is in the civil rights area. That is where my passion and my true love is, because I grew up in the city of Chicago, and I was very fortunate that I got a job at a very young age, 23 years old, as an associate, as a 7-Eleven clerk in the Cook County Public Defender's Office. And I learned a lot there. I learned many things that I could not have learned growing up in the suburbs of Chicago. I learned so much about the marginalization of citizens in the city and how police officers interacted with members of our community. And I saw the injustices that were taking place in the city of Chicago, and that's where I grew. That's where I actually became an adult. Although technically I'd been an adult for a number of years before that, I really grew up in the public defender's office understanding what was happening in the communities and on the streets of Chicago and the interactions between police and members of our community, especially marginalized people. And so that is where my career has taken me, really on a mission to right many wrongs, because that's what a tort lawyer does, right? Torts are wrongs and that we seek to right. And this conversation that we're having today is not meant to be controversial. Now, it can be, it will be, but that's what it's meant to be, instill some sort of emotion and passion so that we can have the conversation and move forward on a path of making communities better, finding reforms, and ensuring that the path that we leave our children is the best one. So let's get into the heart of what we're talking about today, and that's George Floyd. You know, I can say now, because it's been, it happened, George Floyd was murdered on May 25th of 2020. And I will tell you that on May 26th, I didn't see the video until the morning of May 26th, because there were things happening on May 25th that we didn't know about, that video wasn't available, and there was a narrative already that was being spoken about that day about this that you're seeing over my shoulder that we found out was not true. But I was at my kitchen counter that morning in the middle of pandemic, or at the start of pandemic, when a friend of mine from Ohio texted me, "Tony, have you seen this video?" Answer, no. I look at the video, and instantly after I see it, I know this is the biggest, most important civil rights grievance I've ever seen in my life. I said, this will be worldwide. I knew. Now, I had nothing to do with George Floyd at this point, or his family. This is in the morning of May 26th. Within a couple of hours, I was hip deep. I was hip deep in George Floyd, and I became embedded not only in the George Floyd case, but the George Floyd family. And I stayed embedded with them probably for about 15 months, most recently until August of this year. And that's what this discussion is about, more of a personal journey that will lead you into this conversation, understanding the passions, emotions of even a grizzled and hardened and older trial lawyer like me went through in the representation of this family in reaching the moment that we did, not only in the civil settlement, but also, as you must understand, the community requires at least 2 levels of justice, criminal and civil. That's what's important here. So within those couple of hours of me sitting at my kitchen counter watching the video and knowing that this is going to spark something, little did I know what it would spark, but Ben Crump called. Ben and I have been longtime friends. We've been friends for years and years. We've been working on cases for several years before then. And Ben said, "Tony, we're on George." And I knew. And therefore it changed my world, at least temporarily, for a long while, because in order to make the sort of history that these officers did on George, we knew that there had to be an appropriate counterbalance. And that counterbalance was ensuring that we also would make history. When Ben and I spoke that morning, we promised each other one thing, and we did. It was that day. It was that day, because he was just as prescient as I was, as things then, as we know, literally exploded within a day or two. He knew that we needed to make history just in the same manner as we saw something historic happening on a street. It happened to be Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis. So what am I showing you here? The reason I have to show you a YouTube video is because early on, That's all we had access to, right? We didn't have litigation pending. We didn't have subpoena power. We were our own investigators trying to find whatever sources of information and data that we could. But we do know that a very brave young woman, 17-year-old Darnella, she stood there on the street corner and she videotaped this event. And there are lots of heroes, lots of people that need to be commended for what they did that day. Darnella is one of them. And you'll hear about another one, Donald Williams, later. But had it not been for Darnella, may I have the next slide? And we're going to get to it in a moment. Had it not been for Darnella, we would have had a narrative that would have been completely inconsistent with what we learned. Because the narrative that came out on May 25th, 2020, was that George Floyd had a medical emergency and died. Well, let's clear up the record now, as we may. His medical emergency was somebody murdered him. Somebody was kneeling on his neck with his, you can't see it very well, but it's being hidden by the Zoom gallery there, but with somebody forcefully curling their toe to ensure maximum pressure on the carotid artery. Now, I bet you if I took a poll here, that people would know, anecdotally, that you could survive 30 to 40 days without food. That you could survive 3 to 4 days without water. But there's a reason that the back of your brain works in a way that you don't have to think. Because if you had to think about breathing, well, we wouldn't exist. That's an autonomic response. Breathing is not something that we think about. You can't live 3 to 4 minutes without oxygen before there's irreversible brain damage. Death will occur sometime after 6 minutes. So I asked the question, when somebody says to you that I can't breathe, do you take that as truth? Or do you take that as fiction or an excuse to get away? But when somebody says, I can't breathe 27 times, maybe one of those 27 times, you would actually check and reconcile whether or not that person is telling the truth. Now, don't forget, George is lying in what's called a prone position. He's on his stomach, he's on his chest. He's handcuffed behind his back. And there are 2 other officers who are kneeling on his back. So while the oxygen is failing to flow up to his brain, the compression on his chest is also not allowing his lungs to take in any air. So the misinformation that we had certainly would have been a much different, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. We wouldn't have had this discussion at all had it not been for Darnella releasing that video for the world to see. Next slide, please. And you can see that there are these are some of the headlines that came up immediately after George Floyd was murdered. You know, some of them really, the one that I really wanted to point out, Minneapolis police cite fluid situation for troubling misinformation released after George Floyd death. Well, how fluid was it really? How well did that go to really lie and misinform the public? And so bringing you back to my public defender days, see, many of you will take umbrage with what I say, but that's okay. Police officers will create a narrative in order to justify an event. Now, I didn't say all police officers, but some will, and that's wrong. because we need to be transparent. And when we're not transparent, we can't be held accountable. And so what happens then when there's misinformation? When the world, in the middle of a pandemic, who most people were at home at that time, have the opportunity to over and over again watch this killing of a man on the streets of Minneapolis. Next slide, please. Well, it should be next slide, I'm sorry. You have this, right? You have an explosion. You have an explosion of terror. And certainly not anybody, not Ben, nor myself, nor any members of the Floyd family, and I guarantee you if George had been here, would never condone this. This is condemnable. This is not appropriate. But that's what happens when there's a clash of ideals, when you have that misinformation. Now, I wasn't there on this night, but I was there very shortly thereafter. And that's where the rest of my time will be spent with you. Because the previous slide, although you weren't going to read the words, but I'll tell you. Because what Ben and I knew as this was unfolding, this is the day after now, this is May 27th, when the precinct was burned down and Minneapolis started burning, literally. It was Nero's Rome, wasn't it? It was something that was surreal. What happened in Portland, Chicago, Seattle, Miami, New York, London, Sydney, all over the world, people were protesting and appalled at what happened, at how people are treated, at how humans are treated. No human should have been treated the way George was treated. No human should not be believed when they say, I can't breathe. And so what we had to do in order to make the case historic, we had to throw out our litigation playbook, right? Like if I represent one of you, I have, the beginnings of it, I know what I need to do. But here, we knew that if we're going to make history, whatever we thought we knew about what we had to do, garbage, out the door. We reinvented the litigation playbook for this case in order to reach the historic heights that it did. And so one of them was to not only have an independent autopsy done, but have two done. Because part of the misinformation was that George had a medical emergency and that he died from a drug overdose. And so, we needed to confirm that. We didn't know what was going to happen, but we hired top flight people in the country to come in during a pandemic. I don't even want to tell you the challenges that this required for us to bring in doctors from out of state to conduct an autopsy. It's incredible. But these two doctors came up with independent conclusions that George's death was the result of asphyxiation, meaning he couldn't breathe. So what he was saying was consistent. His message to the officers when he was saying, please, I can't breathe, please. Well, it's consistent with the manner of death, right? The cause, I always get those two mixed up. It's cause and manner. Cause is asphyxiation, manner was homicide, right? Death by the hands of another. And so that was part of the litigation playbook, which this is not part of our discussion. But can I have the next slide, please? Because there's so much to talk about. I mean, I could stand here, and I have stood before audiences for hours when they let me. You're not letting me, so I'm not going to do that to you. But when they give me the time, I could really take you through multiple chapters of this case and tell you all the interesting aspects of it. But here, this is the first memorial mass that was held for George in Minneapolis. And above there, you can see I'm sitting in the audience in the first row. And again, there's something very prophetic here. The emotions that were happening behind my shoulders. Not only what I was seeing in front of me, but behind me, to the right of me. To the left of me, I couldn't even tell you the political contingency that came in from around the country to pay respects to George Floyd. It was beyond honorable, because everybody understood that what they saw on video was common sense. And guess what? I can tell you that now almost as a fact, that it is common sense. Why? Well, because we brought this case out without divulging too much to focus groups all over the country in some of the most conservative areas that you could ever think about, layering in some of the most appalling facts about George or the case to get the response back, to understand what our message was. What is it? Is this video wrong? Because you saw the defense of the case. The trial was publicized. He was a manic, drug overdosed, excited delirium individual. Well, we know that not to be true, because when we talk about common sense, that's what the focus groups told us. The video does speak for itself. And the prosecution in this case, Keith Ellison from Minnesota, did such an excellent job because he was able to convey that simple message. It sounds easy, doesn't it? But it's very difficult. And so there to the left on the stage is Ben, and it's a great photograph of him because you can see there him pondering the solemnity of the situation with now the infamous image of George Floyd that really has become synonymous with George, right? The wings, the man. Because the other thing that was happening was that George was being demonized. He was being demonized. It was his fault, wasn't it? Remember that? Had he just complied, this wouldn't have happened. Shame. Oh, I'm sorry, I left out a word before that. Victim shaming. Victim blaming. But let's not talk about the history of racism that exists in the country and the culture that exists between police and community and members of the marginalized community. Because if we do, you would understand that George, when he was approached by Officer Lane, if you remember that infamous picture of Officer Lane approaching George while he was seated in the driver's seat of his car with his gun drawn, with the barrel pointed at his head. That was George's first encounter with the police that day. When he turned around, he saw the barrel of a gun pointed between his eyes. Now, what do you think he was thinking? This is going to go really well? This is going to be a good day for me? He knew that he had a very good chance of not leaving that scene alive. That's what happens. That's what happens. Maybe not for the most of us in this crowd, right? But for some, you have to be scared. If you're encountered by the police at the wrong time, in the wrong car, you're going to be stopped.
Tony, I'm going to jump in.
Please.
We're at about 15 minutes right now.
No. No.
We have a whole library.
Stop. Hours. We need hours.
But I know, life with a trial lawyer. But I'd love for you to talk a bit about the one bad apple versus municipal responsibility. I know that was a key theme, and the messaging became important. And maybe we talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, maybe if we can advance some of the slides too, just to keep something, fresh in the background. So Jen's question is about, you're talking about the bad apple when you're referring to the Minneapolis Police Department. So, look, that's why, 20 minutes Rotary, You should know better. You should know much better.
Go ahead. Our guests know we will not be introducing them after their.
That's okay. I don't want to take time away from anyone. But you have to understand what was behind Derek Chauvin kneeling on George's neck. This I will probably tell you that you haven't heard in the public because it wasn't mostly publicized. And if any of you have heard about it, raise your hand. Raise your hand. Derek Chauvin was trained to do that. He was trained that to restrain somebody who's not cooperating or is resisting. And certainly we can define that he was a passive resistor because he was handcuffed behind his back. Derek Chauvin was trained to kneel on someone's neck. And that was because his trainer, who was also the union head in Minneapolis, Bob Kroll, used to train the Minneapolis Police Department on killology. Does anybody know what killology is? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's the science of killing, right? So your movement, your contact with another human is designed to kill. So Derek Chauvin, people question, why was this murder? Well, because first of all, it's common sense that if you kneel on someone's carotid artery, that you're going to choke them. Anybody understands choking. A 3-year-old understands choking, 4-year-old. So killology was something that was trained within the Minneapolis Police Department, but was banned about maybe 2 or 3 years before George was killed. The problem is what we all have in life, and that's muscle memory or brain memory. Derek Chauvin retained this training, was never, there's a better word for detraining. I don't remember what it is, but there's a word for it. He was never, that education was never taken away from him, so he never de-escalated, right? He only escalated. And so the bad apple in terms of, Jen, who's our chief communications officer, because you'll see there was a lot of pressure on us. There was a lot of pressure on Ben, a lot of pressure on me. How do we message this case? How do we counter? There were cameras on us constantly. Wherever we were, we knew that there would be press, there would be cameras, there would be requests for statements or interviews. And we had to so carefully make sure that we kept the focus on who the focus should be. Not the victim, but the bad apple. But let me tell you about the good apple that came out of this. If we can advance some of the slides. This is part of what you see. What you saw there was part of George's family, all dressed in white, honoring him. That was on the day of his funeral, not the commemoration mass. And the reason that picture evokes a lot of emotion for me is because what you see there is a show of force. You see that George is a human being, not this thing that people described him as. He was loved. His family adored him. He was a real person to them, a member of their family, and he was taken away in a very inappropriate manner. And so and we can move forward. That slide right there, I'm sorry, go back. This slide right here is very important. Get your knee off of our neck. Because one of the first messages that we created was on May 31st, I believe, when we talked about it. We rolled out the message that it wasn't Derek Chauvin who had his knee on George's neck, but it was the Minneapolis Police Department who had their knee on his neck. And then that was taken by one of the greatest orators I've ever seen. Really, not Ben, because he is, but Al Sharpton. Al Reverend Al then took that and talked about a societal knee on Black people. And that's the messaging that came out. We want your knee off of our neck, not just once, but forever. And think about what that would do, not just one-on-one or community on community, but if we all accepted that premise, if we all kept each other's knees off of our collective necks, think of how much better we would be and how far we would progress. If you can continue on, next slide. I don't remember the exact date here, but this is possibly June 2nd or 3rd. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the food store, Cup Foods. That's the location exactly where George was killed. And this is the scene within days of this whole event. This was like this for about 2 to 3 weeks, every day. It was amazing. Amazing because it was during pandemic, right? Number one. And number two, I mean, literally you can see people as far as the eye can see. And this intersection to this date remains closed. And I'll have more slides of what it looks like today because it really has become a memorial. And as a result of that, the George Floyd family has contributed $500,000 to this community because they're suffering too, right? They've become right now it's a tourist stop, but that doesn't bring money into the gas station, does it, when it's closed? So the Floyd family has contributed $500,000 to help those member businesses in that area stay afloat. And so far they have. Next slide. And that's the actual spot where George was killed. It's cordoned off. And what's come out of George Floyd is really something, if we want to call it beautiful, it really is. The artwork, the design, the expressions that have come out of George Floyd are really amazing. And it's something that I hope eventually will be memorialized in a museum or some sort of memoriam for him, because so much urban expression came out of that it would be a horrible loss if it wasn't preserved, because the messaging, forget Jen, I'm sorry, Jen, but there's a lot better messengers out there without us collaborating. You know, they really did a great job, don't you think?
Yes, and they paint a heck of a lot better than.
And they paint a lot better than us too. Next slide. So this was, I don't.
You go on.
Oh.
I'm going to tell our friends in Zoom that you will continue speaking.
I'll wrap it up.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Going, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
Unanimously.
Thank you.
Go on.
Thank you. Oh, keep going. Oh, okay. So I don't know this young man's name. I don't know who he is. You know, I took this picture of him. He was in our car as we were leaving the funeral. But his symbol, so this was within about 10 days now of George being murdered, but his symbol of fist up in the air really became one ubiquitous everywhere we went. Whether it was this man, next slide, or whether it was Ben leading on a cheer or making a point, next slide, or now the fist that's been erected in the middle of 38th in Chicago. So when I showed you that picture of people as far as you can see, well, I was way back here, and there's Cup Foods, and George was murdered right about here, and now this is the center. So this symbol, next slide, is ubiquitous everywhere. This is a business just a couple blocks away, showing the different color fists, right? The unity in community. Isn't that just so simple, so well said? Next slide. This one certainly is very provocative, right? It's a garbage, I'm sorry, am I in the way? It's a garbage can. right? A garbage can with RIP on it. You know, and I turned it into black and white, you know, just because you don't want to see any color there. It's not worthy of color. It should be colorless. It should be something that applies to everyone. And that's what George's death was, a needless waste, because it was a needless death. It never should have happened. Had he gotten up on the first time he said, I can't breathe, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, maybe the fifth time. Okay, I give you 5 chances. Maybe you really can't breathe. We wouldn't have been going through this. Next slide. So this is what I talked to you about. There was, you know, I know there's probably part of you that's saying, oh, come on, Tony, that's being ridiculous. But the truth was, I can't express to you my sleeplessness, the anxiety, because every day was a challenge. And every day, you know, we were looked upon in order to give the right message back. But it wasn't only about messaging, it was about doing the right thing. How do we do something that's right, that's good, that will work for George's memory, for his family, but also for all of you in this audience too, right? Our challenge was the community, was the country, because there was a lot of pressure on us to ensure that what happened did not happen in vain. Now, I'll tell you that Minneapolis, I should say Minnesota, and Minneapolis, they got it. They got the message. When you're burning as hot as they were for as long as they were, with a city shut down as long as they were, you get, it resonates. They reformed the shit out of themselves. They made sweeping changes, new general orders and directives. They do have a better police department, and it will get better because it takes time. It takes time.
And if we jump ahead to the settlement and the civil settlement that came out of it and the collaboration at that press conference, the city wanted to be there. They wanted to stand with you and show that reform and that partnership.
There was not a chance that we could have kept the city of Minneapolis away. Well, we could have, but we didn't, because we did want to show that unity. We wanted to show that collaboration, that this is far more than a black, white, or police community issue, that this is really a unified issue. City stood there with us. Boy, were they humble. Not only were they humble, they were sincere, they meant it. And I'm not easy. I'm, you know, lawyers are skeptics by nature. We're pessimistic because that's how we're trained. They were real. They were very real. Next slide. It's constant. This was constant. And if you say the wrong thing, you know they're going to hang on the wrong thing. Next slide. This was the march in Washington in September of 2020. So we're just 5 months, 6 months into pandemic here, and look at, and I'm there. I took this picture. I'm here. I spoke. I got to speak to this crowd. You talk about an honor. You talk about a highlight in your life. I got to speak to this crowd almost as far as the memorial you can see. But that's how much, not only George Floyd, and Ben does a much better job than I do, but he'd start speaking the names of all those who have been killed, not only since George Floyd, but before George Floyd. When you think of Breonna Taylor, now we all know who Breonna Taylor is, right? George not been killed? I would have said Breonna Taylor, you'd never know who Breonna Taylor was. Breonna came up because George was murdered. And so that's the lesson of George, is what we're doing right here. So all we're doing is really raising awareness. We're having that conversation in order that we can just make ourselves better. Next slide. Anybody know what this is? It's the Jersey fencing, impossible to climb. This is what surrounded the Hennepin County Courthouse in March of this year in anticipation of the Derek Chauvin trial. Minneapolis, once again, was cordoned off. Many of you are familiar with Minneapolis. They have a beautiful downtown. You can crisscross it, almost the entire downtown with their bridges, but it was silent. It was quiet. Go ahead. Next slide. It was militarized. It was militarized with men and women who were geared up looking like this on every corner. Every street was blocked off by some sort of heavy equipment, and we were surrounded by guns constantly. Because, why? You know why? Because the outcome wasn't sure, right? We might be able to now all be really smart and say, well, of course he's guilty. And there's no guarantee. That was the concern. That's why the preparations were like this. Nobody knew what the outcome would be because there was no trust. That's why. There wasn't that reciprocity of trust, which, continue on, ultimately we did get with this verdict, right? We did get that. We saw it. We felt it. People may think, well, there was a celebration. No, it wasn't really a celebration. It was an outpouring of decades, if not centuries, of relief, of letting go, of being able to say, now I can breathe. Next.
So we've got about 3 minutes.
Okay, that we can do.
But you did promise a Donald Williams story, and there he is.
And there he is.
And then maybe a bit about advocacy.
Does anybody remember Donald Williams? He was the one who was at the scene who was telling Chauvin and the other officers, man, you're killing him. You're killing him. You're choking him. Well, Donald, I look at that and I'm just, again, right, the emotion. Well, Donald is an MMA fighter. So don't be mistaken by his size. You don't want to tangle with him. But he knows all the moves. He understands, if he didn't know killology, he knows how to kill, right, in a different way. So that's why he was telling Derek Chauvin. So he was one of the star witnesses. Darnella was a star. He was a star. The other gentleman who was off to the side, who was telling George, just give up, don't resist. Right? Those were the 3 stars, if you were to appoint 3 stars. So that's Donald, because, oh God, was he attacked. They went after him too. Next slide. And this is, as we're awaiting, that's my iPad. And you can see the date, March 12th. That's as we're awaiting now. We saw the result in the criminal trial. We're waiting now for the Minneapolis City Council. They're actually debating right here. They're deliberating, I should say, about whether or not they should settle the case and for how much. And so we're waiting right here. We can't get into, closed session. Open meetings, you can have that, but when there's there are deliberations, those go into closed session. So we're waiting right now with incredible anticipation. Next slide.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. The time is now 12:37 p.m. and the City Council has.
Look at that, there's even a camera on my iPad.
Closed session.
Oh, can we advance that? This is when they're coming back, actually announcing it. And there we see, the next day, the settlement being reported. Next slide. We'll try and stay on time here, 3 minutes. And this is Philonis. Philonis became the spokesperson. This is George's brother. He became really the one that everybody wanted to talk to, because Philonis, first meeting him, he wouldn't talk 2 sentences to you. Now, you can't keep him down because he's become such a great advocate, not only for George, but for Byron Williams in Las Vegas, for Javier Ambler in Texas, for Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, for Leonard Parker in Mississippi, for Ahmed Arbery in Georgia. And the names go on and on. They travel across the country now advocating for all these families. Next slide. So we're going to be ending it right here, and you can move forward with these next 3-4 slides quickly. This is where I stand before you, and I tell you that we collectively failed. We didn't get it done in DC. It didn't happen. I will forever, ever, never understand how we did not get federal legislation out of this. Never. I will forever just not get over this. To think of the moment, if you look at some of the images that you've seen, and we didn't get one law passed in Washington, not even an agreed bill, is shameful. I don't know if you want to call that part of what we did a failure, but I certainly feel that way. But I will tell you how I'm still trying to fix it. I've been going state to state, organization to organization, just like yours right here. So grateful. Talking to all of you. You know, in order to move forward, we need to speak up. And if you speak up what you feel, that you just want what's right, then things will happen. In Illinois, it's happened. We've got state reform bills that have passed that are now law. Minnesota, I already told you. Colorado has it. New Mexico has it. And Ben and I have been going state to state, talking to all the different organizations that we can about what we're doing. Because if we can't get it done on the national level, I'm going to get it done state by state. So the one last image that you didn't see, maybe we passed it up. Go back one more.
It's 2 slides prior.
Yep, go back one more. This is the one I want to leave you on. And can we move the gallery just off to the side? And I promise you, this is my last comments, last slide. This is Mama. This is Mama. So this billboard was erected above Cup Foods. This is actually the corner of 38th in Chicago. And as a lawyer, as a trial lawyer, I could probably give an entire closing argument on George's life with just one image behind me. Because when you think of what a person's life is worth, people say, really, Tony, is a life worth 27 million? And I say, no, it's worth a lot more than that. It's worth tons more. There's no price. But sometimes there is a price because that's what settlement is. But when you think about George lying on the ground, and his last words, we know, were Mama. We also know that his mama was not alive. She'd been dead for years. And so if we can construct that image in our head, if I can leave you with this, construct the image of George on the ground, knowing that he was about to die, pleading not anymore for his breath, but asking for his mama. And his mama, wherever she is, wherever she was at that time, going through the stages of despair, unbelievability, horror that her son is being murdered and that she can't reach him, she can't touch him, and we know that she couldn't save him. This is why this is the right thing to do. Nobody should ever have to plead to breathe and ask for their mama to save them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, now I have to be able to say something. Jennifer, thank you so much. Tony, same to you. Well, we finish our meeting in 6 minutes, as we usually do. Good luck feeling fine the rest of the day. I'm
Sorry I took so much time.
No, I mean, there was silence here because I know everybody who is on Zoom as well would like to hear a lot more, but I am very grateful that we live in a country where, in spite of the horror that happened, we can still be free to have this conversation and do something about it.
I hope so.
We will, and you have many years ahead of you, and for some reason you've been chosen to make a difference. And you will go state by state, or I don't know how it's going to happen, but I think it's only a matter of time.
Well, thank you.
So thank you, Tony, very much. And thank you all for bypassing what we usually do in our meetings, but I have a feeling that every one of you thinks it was worth it. And with that, I close this meeting.